The party was filled with glitz and arrogance. Crystal glasses clinked in the air, filled with expensive champagne, while fake laughter echoed through the exclusive club's grand hall. Alexander Carter watched it all from above, leaning against the mezzanine railing like a bored king surveying his predictable subjects. His sharp eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything, to pull him out of the monotony. That was when Daniel Lawson, his longtime friend and occasional rival, appeared beside him, twirling a glass of red wine between his fingers. "You always look so bored, Alex. Seems like not even your billion-dollar empire can keep you entertained." Alexander raised an eyebrow, but didn't take his eyes off the dance floor. "Maybe because everything is just too predictable," he replied, taking a sip of his drink. Daniel let out a mocking chuckle. "What if I gave you a challenge you couldn't possibly win?" Alexander finally turned to face him, a glimmer of provocation lighting up his eyes. "Try me." Daniel leaned on the railing, pointing outside. The club through the massive glass wall. "Out there on the sidewalk, see that woman?" Alexander narrowed his eyes. In the middle of the dimly lit night, under the yellow glow of the streetlights, a woman sat huddled against the cold stone wall. She wore a worn-out coat and a tattered scarf, her arms wrapped around herself as if that alone could keep the biting. Cold at bay, a plastic cup beside her collected the occasional coin from indifferent passers-by. Alexander observed her in silence. "So?" Daniel teased. "Think you can turn her into a lady of high society?" Alexander leaned back against the railing, unimpressed. "That's easy. What's in it for me?" Daniel smirked. $2 million. But there's a catch. It's not enough to transform her. You have to marry her and stay married for 3 months. For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Then a cynical smile curved his lips. "You really think that would challenge me?" "I think you underestimate what it means to live with someone from a completely different world than yours," Daniel countered. "And more than that, I don't think you have the patience for something like this." Alexander took the last sip of his drink and set the glass down on the nearby table. "Deal." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked down the stairs toward the exit. The freezing wind cut through the night like sharp blades as Alexander approached the woman on the sidewalk. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in the empty space ahead. Her face was partially hidden by her disheveled hair, but when her eyes finally met his, deep blue, filled with stories untold, he felt something stir. Just for a second, she looked him up and down, frowning. "If you want to help, drop a coin in the cup and move along," she said, her voice hoarse as if she rarely spoke to anyone. Alexander smirked. "What if I have a better offer?" The woman crossed her arms, skeptical. "What kind of offer?" He crouched to her level, ignoring the discomfort of the cold seeping through his expensive suit. "I want you to marry me." The silence that followed was almost tangible. She blinked a few times, as if needing a moment to process what she had just heard. "Have you had too much to drink?" Alexander let out a short laugh. "I'm perfectly sober, and I'm serious. A 3-month marriage. You'll have food, clothes, a roof over your head, and at the end of it enough money to start over." She narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing him with suspicion. "Is this some kind of prank?" "Not at all. Just a business arrangement," he said, straightforward. She stared at him for long seconds before exhaling heavily. "How much?" Alexander realized she wasn't asking if she would accept, but rather for how much, a detail that amused him. $1 million! Her eyes widened for a second before she quickly regained her composure. "What's the problem?" "Couldn't find anyone from your world willing to put up with you." Alexander smiled, unbothered. "I don't do business based on feelings. You're here, and I need someone. Simple as that." She lowered her gaze to her freezing hands, fingers trembling and reddened from the cold. Then she clenched them into fists. "Valeria," she said, not looking at him. Alexander tilted his head. "What?" My name, Valeria Brooks. She lifted her eyes again, defiant. If I'm selling 3 months of my life to you, you should at least know my name. Alexander smirked, satisfied. All right, Valeria. Then come with me. She hesitated for a second, as if her mind was still fighting the decision, but then she stood up. The wind blew her hair back, revealing a face marked by exhaustion and a hard life. Alexander felt a brief, almost imperceptible pang in his chest, but he ignored it. He opened the door of the black car that had just pulled up, and Valeria stepped inside, still wary. Alexander followed, instructing the driver to take them to the nearest hotel. As the car moved through the silent city streets, he realized that although he had started this game, something deep inside him told him this challenge wouldn't be as easy as he thought. He just didn't know why. Yet. The car glided silently through the dark city streets. Valeria kept her arms crossed, pressing them against her body as if trying to shield herself from something invisible. On the other side of the seat, Alexander Carter watched her from the corner of his eye, unhurried, as if analyzing a newly acquired asset. "You look uncomfortable," he remarked, his voice cold and controlled. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "I just agreed to marry a stranger in exchange for money. Forgive me if I'm not entirely at ease." Alexander smirked but said nothing. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the muffled sound of tires against the wet asphalt. Valeria turned her gaze to the passing city, the glow of the buildings. Reflecting in the car windows, everything felt distant. "Where are we going?" she asked after a long pause. "A hotel. Tomorrow morning we'll take care of the wedding arrangements." She frowned, turning to face him. "That fast?" Alexander looked at her with boredom. "Did you think this kind of deal drags on for weeks? We're handling business, not romance. The sooner we sign the papers, the sooner you get what you want." Valeria's eyes gleamed with a mix of frustration and resentment. "And what exactly do you want?" Alexander leaned slightly toward her, an enigmatic glint in his eyes. "That, Valeria, you'll find out in time." The hotel was luxurious, boasting gleaming marble floors and a grand lobby adorned with opulent chandeliers. Valeria hesitated for a moment as she stepped out of the car. Her worn-out shoes contrasted almost embarrassingly with the pristine flooring, but she refused to lower her head. Alexander walked ahead without looking back, as if she already belonged in this world and needed no guidance. She followed, feeling out of place, yet determined not to show weakness. In the suite, a waiter entered with a tray of food and 2 glasses of wine. Alexander poured himself a drink first, then handed the other glass to Valeria. "Celebrate, Valeria. You just sold 3 months of your life." She took the glass, but didn't raise it in a toast. "Are you always like this?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Cold, calculating, like the whole world is just a chessboard and people are your pieces." Alexander studied her for a moment before taking a sip of his wine. "And you? Have you always been this judgmental?" She smiled, but there was no joy in it. "I was a different person before I lost everything." Alexander leaned forward slightly, as if examining her reactions. "What happened?" Valeria gripped the wine glass, as if debating whether to answer or not, but instead of opening up, she simply shrugged. "I don't think that's part of the contract." Alexander let out a low chuckle. "Fair enough." The wedding took place. The next day, without luxury, without emotion, just signatures on papers and the presence of a justice of the peace who didn't even bother asking if they were sure about their decision. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," the judge said, completely devoid of enthusiasm. Valeria swallowed hard at the name, Carter. She was now legally part of one of the most powerful families in the country. As they left the courthouse, Alexander placed a hand lightly on her back to guide her toward the car. The touch wasn't gentle, nor aggressive, just automatic, as if he was merely following protocol. A shiver ran down her spine. "And now?" she asked, looking at him without taking his eyes off his phone. Alexander replied, "Now we go home." The Carter estate was more than Valeria had imagined. It wasn't just big, it was monumental. The wrought iron gates opened automatically, revealing a long cobblestone driveway leading to a mansion surrounded by impeccably maintained gardens. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. The silence wasn't welcoming, it was suffocating. Discreet staff members appeared to take their belongings, though Valeria had none. Alexander gave quick, direct instructions to one of the employees. "Prepare a room for my wife." The word wife sounded empty, almost mechanical. Valeria raised an eyebrow. "Separate rooms?" Alexander stopped in the middle of the grand hall and looked at her. "Is that a problem for you?" She crossed her arms. "No, I just assumed you'd expect something more traditional," he smirked. "This marriage was never traditional, Valeria." And with that, he turned and ascended the grand staircase, leaving her standing alone at the entrance. A knot formed in Valeria's stomach. Something about this house, this man, this entire situation felt deeper than just a simple wager. She just didn't know exactly what. The door to her room clicked shut behind her. Valeria let out a heavy sigh, feeling the weight of the past half hour settle on her shoulders. The wedding, the impersonal courthouse, the arrival at the mansion, it all felt surreal, as if she were living someone else's story. The bedroom was large, sophisticated, but impersonal. Neutral-toned walls, perfectly arranged furniture, an absurdly soft bed. No sign that anyone had ever truly lived there. She approached the vanity, running her fingers across the polished surface. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her, but it didn't feel familiar. "You did this for the money. It's just business. A contract." Valeria closed her eyes for a moment, trying to convince herself that none of this would matter in the end. So why wouldn't the tight knot in her throat disappear? The first night in the Carter mansion passed without incident. Alexander never appeared, which, in a way, was a relief. The next morning, breakfast was served in the enormous dining hall. Valeria entered hesitantly, finding Alexander already seated, impeccably dressed, with a folded newspaper beside his coffee cup. "Sleep well?" he asked, not bothering to look up from his phone. "The mattress is more comfortable than the street pavement," she replied with a hint of irony. Alexander raised an eyebrow, finally glancing at her. "Do you plan on provoking me every morning?" She shrugged, picking up a piece of bread. "Depends. Do you plan on acting like a robot every morning?" A smirk flickered across his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting. I thought you'd be more grateful for what you've been given." Valeria set the bread down on her plate with more force than necessary. "I'm not ungrateful, but I'm not blind either. I know I'm here for a reason that has nothing to do with your supposed generosity." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "And what reason would that be, in your opinion?" She met his gaze head-on. "You think you bought me, but in reality, I think I bought your time, because anything is better than facing your own emptiness, isn't it?" Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then, as if nothing had happened, he took another sip of his coffee. "After breakfast, your training begins." "Training?" Valeria scoffed. "Yes, you'll be introduced to high society soon. I want you prepared." She crossed her arms. "I'm not one of your projects, Alexander." He stood and looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "No, but now you are my wife, and your image reflects mine." Without another word, he left the room. Valeria remained seated, staring into the empty space, feeling like a chess piece moved without her consent. But that wouldn't last. The training began that afternoon. 2 stylists arrived with dozens of dresses, shoes, and accessories. A seasoned hairdresser examined every strand of her hair like he was planning to reconstruct her. And an older woman, with an air of strict elegance named Madame Teresa, appeared to teach her etiquette, posture, and refined manners. Valeria hated every second of it. She hated the tight dresses. She hated the uncomfortable shoes. She hated balancing a book on her head just to learn how to walk like a lady. And above all, she hated feeling like she was disappearing. But the worst came that night. It was late when Valeria decided to leave her room. She needed air, needed to feel like she still had some control over her life. She wandered through the silent corridors of the mansion, absorbing the grandeur and coldness surrounding her. At the end of one hallway, she found a door slightly ajar. Alexander's office. She hesitated, but before she could think twice, she stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The scent of leather and cognac lingered in the air. Books lined the shelves in perfect order, documents stacked neatly on the mahogany desk. Then something caught her attention. A framed photograph. She moved closer, picking it up. The picture showed a younger Alexander standing beside an older man, clearly his father. But it was another detail that made the breath catch in her throat. She had been here before, not in this office, but in this company. She recognized the man in the photo. He was the CEO of Carter Industries, and years ago she had sat in a job interview in that very company. And Alexander, a cold shock ran through her. Alexander Carter was the man who had rejected her in that interview years ago. With chilling indifference, without even looking at her resume, with just one sentence, he had shattered her chance at a better future. We don't waste time on people without potential. The memory hit her like a tidal wave. That day, Valeria had walked out of that building humiliated. It was the beginning of the end. Her life unraveled after that rejection. And now, she was married to the man who had brought her down. Her hands trembled. What did this mean? Did Alexander remember her? Or was she so insignificant that he didn't even recognize who she was? Valeria carefully placed the photo back and left the office, her heart pounding in her chest. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind spun. If he didn't remember her, maybe she could use that to her advantage. But if he did, then why had he chosen her for this game? Either way, there was a new rule in play. Alexander Carter wasn't the only one who knew how to play the game. The morning arrived cold, but the weight in Valeria's chest was even colder than the wind that seeped through the Carter mansion's windows. She pulled on a silk robe left by the maids and walked across the vast bedroom, feeling the contrast. Between her tense body and the smooth fabric against her skin, she needed to test Alexander. If he truly didn't remember her, then Valeria was nothing more than a disposable piece in his game. But if, for some reason, he did know who she was and still chose her, what was really behind this farce? The silence of the room started to suffocate her. She decided to leave. The scent of fresh coffee filled the dining hall. Valeria entered with steady steps, refusing to look out of place. Alexander was already at the table, impeccably dressed, flipping through his newspaper with the ease of a man who controlled his world. She pulled out a chair and sat down without asking for permission. Alexander lifted his eyes for a fraction of a second before returning to his paper. Finally decided to come down for breakfast. I didn't know there was a set schedule. He set the newspaper aside, picking up his coffee cup with calculated precision. Loud day there isn't, but discipline is something I expect. Valeria smirked slightly. Discipline. Such a charming word for a marriage. Alexander observed her for a moment before resting his elbows on the table, fingers interlaced. You still think this is a game? She tilted her head, tracing the rim of her plate with her fingers. "Isn't it?" He smirked lightly. "Maybe, but games have rules. Don't you think you're trying to change the pieces too soon? And don't you think you're underestimating your opponent?" Something flickered in Alexander's eyes. Unreadable. "I never underestimate anyone, Valeria." She held his gaze for a few seconds before taking a sip of her juice. Alexander returned to his newspaper, but Valeria knew that in that moment a new phase of the game had begun. The rest of the day passed much like the others. Madame Teresa arrived precisely at 3 o'clock for another round of educational torture. "More elegance, more grace," she instructed, tapping her cane on the floor as Valeria practiced walking in impossibly high heels. With every step, Valeria imagined throwing those heels at Alexander's head. When the training finally ended, she was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. She needed to act. She put on one of the refined dresses that had been forced upon her and descended the grand staircase, determined to explore the house she was now, against her will, supposed to call home. But as she passed through the main hall, voices from Alexander's office stopped her. She hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and a male voice, distinct from Alexander's, carried through the space. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" the voice asked. "It's none of your business, Henry," Alexander responded coolly. "You've never done anything like this before, Alexander. This doesn't seem like your kind of move." Valeria held her breath. "I have everything under control," Alexander assured. "She's not a problem." Her chest tightened. "Not a problem." She stepped away before she could hear more. If Alexander thought she wasn't a problem, it was time to prove him wrong. Later that night, Valeria found Alexander in the lounge, sipping whiskey on one of the dark leather sofas. She entered without hesitation, letting the sound of her heels echo against the marble floor. Alexander lifted his eyes slowly, assessing her presence. "Any particular reason for dressing up at this hour?" Valeria sat on the sofa across from him, crossing her legs with a deliberate calm. "I'm getting used to the role of Mrs. Carter. You said discipline is essential, so I'm committing." Alexander took another sip of whiskey before replying. "Curious. I'd say you're testing limits." She smiled, picking up a wineglass left by one of the staff on the table. "What if I am?" Alexander studied her, twirling his glass between his fingers. "Just be careful. Not all games end the way we expect." Valeria took a sip of her wine, not breaking eye contact. "And not all players are predictable." Alexander smirked, but this time there was something different about it, something that sent a shiver down Valeria's spine. For a second she wondered, what if, in the end, she wasn't just playing against Alexander, but against something much bigger? The night felt suffocating, not from heat, but from the heavy silence that had settled between Valeria and Alexander after their last exchange of glances. He knew she was testing limits, and now she knew he was hiding something. The game had truly begun. The next morning, Valeria woke up to soft knocks on her door. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Alexander asked that you get ready. You have an event tonight," one of the maids announced. She stretched, feeling the soreness from Madame Teresa's relentless training. "What kind of event?" she asked as she got out of bed. "A business dinner." Valeria frowned. A business dinner? Why would he take her to something like that? She put on a robe and walked onto her bedroom's balcony. From there she spotted Alexander in the garden, speaking on the phone, his expression rigid. His subtle gestures revealed irritation, small movements but noticeable to someone paying attention. Something isn't going as planned, and Valeria wanted to know what. The dress chosen for her that evening was impeccable, black, elegant, with no unnecessary embellishments. Her hair was pulled into a classic updo, exposing the curve of her neck. When she descended the staircase, Alexander was already waiting in the hall. His eyes flicked over her quickly, assessing her like a product being prepped for display. "Not bad," he remarked, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. Valeria smirked. "What a charming compliment. I'll be sure to write that down in my diary." Alexander ignored her sarcasm and extended his arm. "Let's go." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand on his. The sensation of his touch was strange, not warm nor entirely cold. It was neutral, hiding far more than it revealed. As they entered the car, Valeria decided she wouldn't spend the night as mere decoration. She was going to figure out exactly what was happening. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting the warm candlelight from tables set with meticulous precision. As soon as they entered, they were led to a private section at the back of the room. A couple was already waiting. The man was tall, with sharp features and an expression that spoke of calculation. The woman, in contrast, was all softness, blonde, with a practiced smile and eyes that assessed every move. Alexander shook the man's hand. "Leonardo." "Carter," he replied with a cordial nod. The blonde woman stood and extended her hand to Valeria. "Olivia Vaughan," she said with a warm smile. "A pleasure to meet you." The last name immediately triggered an alert in Valeria's mind. Vaughan. She cast a quick glance at Alexander, but his face remained unreadable. So that's it. Edward Vaughan, the man who had bet against Alexander, had a connection to this couple. And if Valeria was right, this dinner wasn't just about business. It was a test. She took Olivia's hand and shook it lightly. "The pleasure is mine." They sat down. The waiter poured wine, and polite conversation ensued, but Valeria caught the way Olivia observed her, curious, analytical, as if waiting for her to slip up. Do they want to see if I belong in this world? Then she would show them she didn't just belong, she could master it. Throughout the meal, Alexander and Leonardo discussed mergers, contracts, and investments. Valeria remained silent, absorbing every detail, until Olivia, with her poised smile, interrupted the conversation. "Valeria, tell me, how did you and Alexander meet?" The question was innocent on the surface, but Valeria recognized the bait. She could tell the truth. She could expose everything right there at the table and watch Alexander's carefully constructed facade crumble. But that would be too obvious a move. So, she smiled. "It was unexpected," she said, picking up her wineglass. "I was going through a difficult time and, let's just say, Alexander appeared at the right moment." Leonardo raised an eyebrow. The right moment. Valeria met Alexander's eyes for a brief second before continuing. "Yes, he has a tendency to show up when you least expect it." Alexander smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Seems to be a trait of mine." Leonardo chuckled. "Yes, you've always had a knack for surprising people." Olivia crossed her legs, tilting her head slightly. "And how has your transition into this world been, Valeria? I imagine it must be quite the adjustment." Valeria held her glass firmly. The real shock was realizing that the people in this world play as many games as those outside of it. The silence that followed lasted a beat too long. Alexander smiled. "Do you like games, Valeria?" She looked straight at him, unwavering. "That depends on the prize." Olivia and Leonardo exchanged a subtle glance, but said nothing more. The waiter returned with dessert, dissolving the tension. But Valeria knew this dinner wasn't about business. It was about her. And now, more than ever, she was certain there was something much bigger behind all of this. The only question was, how far would Alexander Carter go to ensure she never found out? The dinner ended with controlled smiles and polite goodbyes, but the tension lingered in the air, like a scent too strong to fade quickly. In the car, silence hung heavily between Valeria and Alexander. The city lights flickered past the windows, dancing across their faces, but neither seemed interested in the view. Alexander kept his eyes on the road ahead. You handled yourself well. Valeria turned her head slowly, assessing his tone. I know. He let out a quiet, amused exhale, as if her response didn't surprise him. So you noticed. She crossed her arms. That wasn't a business dinner. Yes, it was an evaluation. Alexander glanced at her briefly, his expression cold and calculated. And what do you think they concluded? Valeria held his gaze, a small smile forming on her lips. That you may have made a mistake in choosing me. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. Is that so? You didn't notice how Olivia was analyzing me? As if she was searching for a crack in the mask? Alexander remained silent for a moment, before focusing back on the road. People are always looking for cracks in others, and sometimes, Valeria continued, leaning in slightly, they find them. He didn't react, but she knew her words had struck something, and she intended to keep pressing that crack until the truth finally came out. When they arrived at the mansion, Alexander stepped out first without waiting for her. Valeria followed at her own pace, ascending the grand steps calmly. Good night, Valeria, he said without looking back, before stepping into his office and closing the door. She stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. Then, instead of heading to her room, she kept walking. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. She just knew something was wrong, and that Alexander Carter was hiding much more than just a ridiculous bet with Edward Vaughan. Then she saw it, a sliver of light beneath the office door. Alexander wasn't one to leave lights on without reason. Curious, she stepped closer, pressing her ear against the wooden surface. And no, it's not time yet. Valeria held her breath, his voice. She heard footsteps, the clink of ice against glass. I said I have everything under control. A pause. No, she doesn't know anything. Her stomach twisted. She stepped back slowly, heart pounding. No, she doesn't know anything. What don't I know, Alexander? She needed to find out. The night was long, and Valeria barely slept. By the time the sun finally rose, she decided she wasn't going to sit around waiting for answers. The first thing she did was seek out Madame Teresa. The woman was already in the sitting room, sipping tea with the impeccable elegance of someone who breathed discipline and rules. Ah, you finally woke up early, she commented without looking up from her cup. Valeria sat across from her, getting straight to the point. I need you to teach me something new today. Madame Teresa raised an eyebrow. Oh? And what might that be? Valeria leaned in slightly. How to extract information without the other person realizing it. For the first time, the older woman smiled. Interesting. Then, after taking another sip of tea, she said, Let's begin. Throughout the afternoon, Valeria absorbed every lesson like a sponge. Madame Teresa taught her subtle techniques. Questions disguised as innocent curiosity, calculated pauses to force the other person to fill the silence, gestures and glances that led people to reveal more than they intended. By the end of the training, Valeria felt armed. Now she needed an opportunity, and it arrived sooner than expected. That evening, during dinner, their first shared meal since the Vaughan dinner, Alexander was quieter than usual. He sipped his wine slowly, watching her now and then, as if trying to decipher what was on her mind. Valeria decided to test what she had learned. Do you always work so late? She asked casually. Alexander dabbed his lips with a napkin before replying. Someone has to. She let out a small laugh. And here I thought you had an army of employees for that. Alexander smirked but didn't respond. Valeria leaned forward slightly. Or maybe what you do at night has nothing to do with work at all. He raised an eyebrow. What are you implying? She shrugged. I heard you in your office last night. For a brief moment something flickered in his eyes. But instead of denying it or getting angry, Alexander simply leaned back in his chair, studying her. "And what do you think you heard?" Valeria held his gaze. "You were assuring someone that I don't know anything." He remained motionless. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. "You're learning quickly." Her heartbeat quickened. "Is that a compliment?" "It's a warning." The air between them grew thick. Alexander took the last sip of his wine and stood. "Good night, Valeria." She watched him leave, his steps firm, unwavering. But at that moment, she knew. He was hiding something big. And for the first time, Valeria was absolutely certain this wasn't just about the bet. It was something much worse. The tension from dinner still lingered in the air as Alexander left the dining room. His warning echoed in Valeria's mind. This is a warning. He hadn't denied anything, hadn't tried to dismiss her suspicions. He had simply challenged her in silence, and that meant she was closer to the truth than she had imagined. But she still needed more. She took a deep breath, setting her wineglass down without finishing it. Her heart pounded with adrenaline. Alexander Carter might be meticulous, but no one was perfect. She just had to find the crack. Later that night, Valeria waited patiently. When the clock struck 2:13 a.m., the house was steeped in silence. Alexander had yet to return to his bedroom. She pushed the covers aside and walked barefoot to the door, turning the knob slowly. The hallway was dark, dimly lit by the soft glow of the wall sconces. She knew where he would be. Alexander Carter seemed to live surrounded by secrets, always locked away with his papers, his phone calls, his promises that she knew nothing. She descended the stairs slowly, soundlessly, like a ghost in her own house. As she neared the office, she noticed something. The door wasn't fully closed, a rare mistake for Alexander. Valeria suppressed a smile. She nudged the door just enough to get a glimpse inside. Alexander stood near his desk, a phone in one hand, a glass of whiskey in the other. "This needs to be handled flawlessly." His voice was low but sharp. A pause. Valeria couldn't hear the other person on the line. "No, she can't find out." His grip on the glass tightened. "If she does, everything could fall apart." A chill ran down Valeria's spine. She. He was talking about her. What was so important that if she discovered it, everything would collapse? Her pulse raced, adrenaline flooding her veins. She knew she couldn't stay much longer without getting caught, so she backed away slowly, retreating down the hall without making a sound. Once she reached her room, she shut the door and took a deep breath. Alexander Carter had a secret, and, now, more than ever, she was determined to uncover it. The next morning, Alexander acted as if nothing had happened. He came down for breakfast, already dressed for work, as immaculate as ever, sipping his coffee in composed silence. But Valeria noticed something different. He was watching her, subtly but attentively, measuring what she knew. "Sleep well?" he asked casually. Valeria took a sip of her juice, meeting his gaze. "Of course, the house is so quiet at night." Alexander didn't react immediately, but something flickered in his eyes. "Good." He picked up a piece of bread, seeming distracted. "Do you have plans for today?" "Not yet." "Perfect. Tonight you'll make your first public appearance as my wife." She blinked, surprised. "Public appearance? A charity event. It'll be a good test for you." Valeria narrowed her eyes. "Or will it be a test for you?" Alexander chuckled softly, finishing his coffee. "I guess we'll both find out." The charity gala was set for the evening, leaving Valeria the entire day to prepare, or rather, to plan her next move. She knew Alexander was hiding something. She also knew the answers were in that office, but breaking in at night was risky. She needed something better. Then she remembered someone, Henry. The man who had been in Alexander's office that night. The one who seemed concerned about something. If Alexander wouldn't talk, maybe Henry would. Now she just had to find a way to reach him. At the gala, Valeria was introduced as the new Mrs. Carter. Her golden dress draped over her skin like liquid silk, and curious eyes followed her every step alongside Alexander. She smiled, made conversation, greeted powerful figures. She played the part, but her focus was elsewhere. Henry was there, tall, well-dressed, but different from the other men in that circle. He didn't seem entirely at ease, and Valeria decided this was the perfect opportunity. She seized a moment when Alexander was deep in conversation with other businessmen and quietly slipped across the room toward Henry. He noticed her approach, raising an eyebrow. "Mrs. Carter," she smiled. "Just Valeria." Henry hesitated briefly before returning the smile. "I didn't expect to see you here alone. I thought it was time to introduce myself to my husband's friends." Henry let out a low chuckle. "Friend isn't exactly the right word." Valeria tilted her head. "Then what are you?" Henry took a sip of his drink, glancing away briefly. "Let's just say I know too much about what happens behind the curtain." Valeria's stomach tightened. She stepped closer. "Then tell me, what's behind the curtain?" Henry studied her for a long moment, then exhaled heavily. "You're playing with fire, Valeria." She smiled, but without humor. "I've been burning for a while now." Henry looked around, as if debating something. Then, leaning in slightly, he whispered, "If you really want to know, check the office, the locked drawer on the right." Valeria's heart pounded. Henry straightened, regaining his composure, and added in a casual tone, "But remember, some truths can't be undone." Then, before she could ask anything else, he disappeared into the crowd. Valeria stood there, champagne glass forgotten in her hand, blood thrumming in her ears. The office, the locked drawer. Now she knew exactly where to look, but she had no idea if she was ready for what she would find. The night was still young, but Valeria's mind was far from the charity event. The hall remained filled with polite conversations, rehearsed laughter and champagne toasts, but for her it had all become a blur. "If you really want to know, check the office, the locked drawer on the right." Henry's words echoed in her head like a distant bell, a muted warning overshadowed by her hunger for the truth. She cast a discreet glance toward Alexander, who was engaged in conversation with a group of businessmen. He seemed relaxed, confident, like a man certain that no one would ever dare breach his walls. But he underestimated one thing. Her, Valeria, picked up a champagne flute from a passing waiter and smiled subtly at Alexander from across the room, the image of a perfect wife. He returned the gesture with a slight nod before turning back to his discussion. Perfect. Without drawing attention, she weaved through the guests and slipped out of the ballroom, making her way through the hotel corridors. Her heart pounded. She needed to get to the mansion before Alexander. The drive back felt like an eternity. The chauffeur didn't question her when she asked to be taken home before Alexander. Maybe he assumed she was simply tired of the event. Maybe that was for the best. When she arrived, the staff greeted her politely, but she headed straight for the second floor without a word. She couldn't hesitate. The moment she stepped into the office, she closed the door behind her and turned the key in the lock. The room was steeped in shadows, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the windows. Taking a deep breath, Valeria crossed the space and knelt in front of Alexander's desk. There it was, the locked drawer on the right. Her hands were cold. She tugged at the drawer, testing it, locked. She had expected that, but Alexander Carter was a meticulous man, and meticulous men rarely bothered to hide their keys in unpredictable places. And she was right. Rummaging through the upper compartments of the desk, she found a small metal key tucked beneath a stack of papers. Her heart pounded harder. With trembling fingers, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. Click. The lock released, Valeria hesitated for a second, holding her breath. Then she pulled the drawer open. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. Papers, documents, but not just any documents, photographs. She picked up the first stack, flipping through them, and felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. They were photos of her. Valeria shut her eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the chill crawling up her spine. She turned another page, receipts of transactions, numbers, detailed financial movements. And then she found something even worse. A contract. Her name was there, and beneath it, Alexander Carter's signature. Her stomach twisted. She didn't know how long she sat there, staring at the proof of what she had already suspected. But now, there was no doubt. Alexander hadn't chosen her by chance. From the very beginning, he had known exactly who she was. The impact of the truth hit her like a violent wave, knocking the air from her lungs. He knew. He always knew. So why had he chosen her? What did he want from her? She turned to the last page of the contract, her fingers trembling as she read the final clause. After the period of 90 days, this contract will be terminated without the right to any appeal. However, if the condition is met before the stipulated time, termination will be immediate. Condition. What would happen if she discovered the truth before time ran out? Valeria's eyes widened as she tried to piece it all together. But before she could think, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. Alexander. He was back. Panic rushed through her veins, but she forced herself to move. Quickly, she shoved the papers back into the drawer and locked it just in time. The key was still in her hand when the doorknob turned. She spun around just as Alexander stepped inside, his expression cool and unreadable. His eyes swept over the room. "What are you doing here?" Valeria gripped the key tightly, hiding it in her closed fist. "I couldn't sleep." Alexander took a step forward, shutting the door behind him. "And you thought the office was a good place to pass the time?" She forced a smile. "Didn't you say I should learn about your world?" Alexander tilted his head slightly, studying her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Be careful, Valeria. Some truths aren't as beautiful as you might think." Her blood turned to ice, but she didn't look away. Some truths don't need to be beautiful. They just need to be real. Alexander let out a quiet chuckle, but the gleam in his eyes wasn't amusement. "If you keep digging, you might find something you'd rather not know." He stepped closer, and Valeria felt the air around her grow heavier. "So tell me, wife," he murmured. "Are you ready for that?" Her heartbeat thundered in her chest. She wanted to answer, but the words felt trapped in her throat. Alexander leaned in slightly, his presence suffocating. "Or are you afraid of what you might uncover?" Her eyes burned with silent defiance. "Maybe you should ask yourself the same question, Alexander." He remained still for a moment. Then he smirked. "Good night, Valeria." He turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. Valeria finally let out the breath she had been holding, but her heart was still racing. She had found the proof, but she still didn't have the answers. And now Alexander Carter knew she was looking. From this moment on, she couldn't afford a single mistake, because the hunt had begun, and Valeria didn't know if she was the predator or the prey. The room was dark, but Valeria wasn't sleeping. Her eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling, as her mind tried to organize the chaos she had uncovered. Alexander knew, he had always known. She wasn't an accident, not a random gamble. She had been chosen, and now the question that mattered most wasn't why, but what happens when I uncover the truth. Somewhere across the mansion, Alexander was likely awake too. He knew she was searching, and that changed everything. Morning arrived quickly, unrelenting. When Valeria descended for breakfast, Alexander was already seated at the table, as immaculate as ever. But this time, the silence between them was sharper. She sat down, poured herself some coffee, and took a slow sip before looking at him. Alexander flipped through his newspaper with deliberate ease, pretending disinterest, but Valeria knew he was waiting. "So," she said casually, "what's on the agenda today?" Alexander lowered the newspaper slowly, meeting her gaze. "Interested in my business now? Maybe. I figured it's time I understood my husband's world a little better." His lips curved slightly. "Interesting. So, you want to spend the day at the office with me?" Valeria tilted her head, measuring the challenge hidden in the question. She knew he wanted to see how far she would go. So, she smiled. "I'd love to." Alexander held her gaze for a moment longer before taking a sip of coffee. "Then get ready. We leave in an hour." She nodded, masking the unease stirring inside her. If Alexander was playing a game, she would play it better. Carter Industries was as cold and flawless as its owner. Valeria walked through the pristine corridors of the building with Alexander at her side, ignoring the subtle stares from the employees. She knew what they were thinking, the unknown wife of the powerful magnate, a woman who didn't belong in this world. But what none of them realized was that she was here for something far more dangerous. When they arrived at Alexander's office, he held the door open for her. "Welcome to the heart of the empire." Valeria let her eyes roam the space. The office was even larger than the one at the mansion. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, and the massive mahogany desk sat at the center, adorned with neatly arranged documents. Alexander walked to his chair and sat, fingers interlaced atop the desk. "So, where would you like to start?" Valeria kept her expression neutral. "Show me whatever you want. I'm curious to see how you built all of this." Alexander studied her for a moment before sliding a slim dossier across the desk. "Let's test that curiosity then." She picked up the document, flipping through the pages filled with numbers and business terminology that meant little to her at first glance. Then something caught her eye. A name, Edward Vaughan. Her breath hitched for a second. Edward's name appeared on multiple pages, financial transactions, contracts, and, strangest of all, transactions directly tied to Alexander. Valeria slowly lifted her gaze. Alexander was watching her with a faint smirk. He wanted her to see this. "Recognize something?" he asked, his voice calm. She closed the folder deliberately, holding his gaze. "Just enough to know Edward isn't just an old friend." Alexander leaned back, clearly satisfied. "Very good, Valeria. You're learning quickly." She swallowed the frustration rising within her. Alexander was testing her, but he wasn't the only one who knew how to play. Hours later, back at the mansion, Valeria could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Alexander had left a trail of clues on purpose. But why? She paced her room, thoughts racing. Edward and Alexander had business together, so why the bet? What was between them that Alexander wanted to keep hidden? She knew she wouldn't find all the answers alone. She needed more information. She needed Henry. Moving discreetly through the halls of the mansion, Valeria kept her footsteps light. If Henry knew something was wrong, he might help her piece the puzzle together. But before she could take another step, a voice cut through the silence. "Going somewhere?" Her heart stopped for a second. Alexander stood at the end of the corridor, leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. He didn't look surprised. He had been waiting. She forced a smile. "Just needed some air." Alexander tilted his head. "In the middle of the night?" Valeria shrugged. "Since when do I need permission to walk around my own house?" Uncrossing his arms, Alexander pushed off the wall and walked toward her, slow and deliberate. You can go wherever you want, Valeria, but I have to wonder, are you really just exploring the house, or are you looking for something else? The air between them thickened. Valeria kept her expression smooth. What exactly do you think I'm looking for? Alexander stopped just inches from her. Inches. His gaze was sharp, cutting through her as if he could see beneath her skin. I don't know yet, he admitted, voice low, almost a whisper. But what intrigues me most, Valeria, is why you're still here. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Alexander leaned in slightly, his presence suffocating. You already know I knew who you were. You know this wasn't random. So why haven't you left yet? Valeria clenched her fists. He wanted her to admit it, to say she was playing, but she wouldn't give him that. She smiled instead, tilting her head, eyes flashing with challenge. Maybe I enjoy the danger. Alexander was silent for a beat, then he smirked. Then I think you're going to love what happens next. He stepped back, slow and deliberate, leaving her in the dimly lit corridor, breath uneven and mind in turmoil. Alexander knew she was close to the truth, and now the game had become even more dangerous. But Valeria wouldn't back down. She was determined to uncover everything, even if it meant facing something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The tension from the previous night still weighed on Valeria's shoulders. Alexander knew. He might not have all the answers yet, but he knew she was digging. And worse, he seemed to enjoy the game. But what he didn't know was that Valeria was already one step ahead. Now she couldn't afford impulsive moves. She needed strategy. If Alexander was playing this game like a master, then she would be the piece he could never predict. Breakfast unfolded in a near-deafening silence. Alexander sat there as usual, reading the newspaper, his expression unreadable. But Valeria noticed the details, the way he glanced at her every so often, the way he waited for her to speak first, as if he was evaluating her reaction. She wouldn't give him that advantage. Instead, she took a sip of her coffee, stood up, and began walking toward the exit. "Where are you going?" Alexander asked, not lifting his eyes from the paper. She paused, glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "You said I should learn more about your world, so today I'm doing it my way." Alexander finally looked up, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "And what way would that be?" "Finding out," he smirked, folding the newspaper. "Valeria, you're playing with something that could swallow you whole." She tilted her head, defiant. "Then maybe it's time to find out if I'm the prey or the predator." Alexander chuckled softly. "A dangerous sound. Careful, wife. Some answers can't be undone." She kept her smile in place, but deep inside, a shiver ran down her spine. She knew that, but she wasn't turning back. Her first destination that morning wasn't just anywhere. It was Henry's office, the only person who seemed to want her, to find something. Valeria didn't schedule a meeting, didn't announce her arrival. She simply appeared at the reception, impeccably dressed, wearing confidence like armor. The receptionist blinked in surprise. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Henry Vaughan." The woman hesitated. "He's in a meeting right now, but tell him it's Valeria Carter." The receptionist swallowed, typed something on her computer, and within seconds looked up. He asked you to come up immediately." Valeria smiled. Of course he did. Henry's office was smaller than Alexander's, but it had a completely different energy. It was structured, but in a way that felt human, without the calculated coldness that surrounded Alexander like a second skin. When she entered, Henry was already waiting, standing beside his desk, arms crossed. "I knew you'd be back." Valeria shut the door behind her. "Then tell me, what is Alexander Carter hiding?" Henry exhaled, rubbing his jaw before walking to a drawer. He pulled out a thick, sealed envelope and tossed it onto the desk. "Here are some of the answers you're looking for." Valeria didn't hesitate. She tore the envelope open and slid out the documents. And what she saw made her stomach drop. Financial records. Alexander and Edward had a far deeper connection than just a reckless bet. Enormous transactions between their companies, strange money transfers, and then the detail that made her breath catch: her name. Her name was linked to a multi-million-dollar transfer made before Alexander ever approached her with his marriage proposal. The floor seemed to fall away beneath her. She lifted her eyes to Henry, who watched in silence. "What does this mean?" Her voice was quieter than she intended. Henry leaned on the desk. "It means Alexander didn't just know who you were. He paid to ruin you." The world around her spun. She couldn't breathe. "You're lying." Henry shook his head. "I wish I was." She looked back at the papers, her mind racing too fast, trying to make sense of it all. Alexander had orchestrated her downfall before offering her salvation. Why? Her chest tightened. Everything she had endured over the past years had been planned. Had Alexander destroyed her only to later extend a helping hand? Was that what he did? Create victims so he could play savior? Her hands trembled. Henry gave her a moment before speaking again. "I don't know his exact reason, Valeria, but I can guarantee one thing. Nothing that happened to you was by accident." She closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. When she opened them again, she knew exactly what she had to do. The drive back to the mansion was a blur. Her hands still clutched the envelope, the documents burning against her skin. Every word, every number, every piece of evidence. Alexander had destroyed her before he had ever met her, and now she knew. The first thing she saw upon entering the mansion was Alexander, sitting in the lounge, a glass of whiskey in hand, utterly relaxed, as if nothing was about to come crashing down. But it was, and he was about to realize it. Valeria strode across the room, her heels clicking against the marble, and tossed the envelope onto the table before him. Alexander didn't look surprised. He simply glanced at the envelope, then up at her. "I thought you'd take longer to find it." Her stomach twisted. "So you knew I would figure it out." Alexander took a slow sip of whiskey, setting the glass down carefully. "I always knew." Her blood boiled. "You ruined my life." Her voice shook with anger. "You destroyed me before even offering this damn proposal." Finally, Alexander stood, moving deliberately, his gaze locked onto hers. "And now that you know, Valeria, what will you do?" The silence between them was thick, electric, like the calm before a storm. Valeria's chest rose and fell rapidly. She wanted to scream, to hurt him the way he had hurt her. But Alexander Carter wasn't just a powerful man. He was a dangerous one. And now she was entangled in something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The real question was, should she run, or should she destroy Alexander before he destroyed her first? The silence was unbearable. Valeria felt her body tremble, not from fear, but from pure fury. Alexander Carter stood before her, completely calm, as if he hadn't just been exposed. He had always known the truth would reach her, and now he watched her with that same calculated gaze, analyzing every expression, every movement. "He wants to see what I'll do next." But even she didn't know yet. She wanted to destroy him. She wanted to bring down everything he had built, just as he had destroyed her. But she also wanted answers. And if there was one thing she had learned since stepping into this mansion, it was that Alexander Carter never gave anything away for free. She inhaled deeply, steadying her breath. "Why?" Her voice came out lower than she intended, but dripping with venom. Alexander tilted his head, studying her. "You'll have to be more specific." She clenched her fists. "Why did you do this to me? Why did you destroy my life, and then offer salvation as if it were some grand act of generosity?" Alexander walked slowly to the table, picked up the envelope. and pulled out the documents, scanning them as if rereading an old contract. "Because I needed you to be in the right place at the right time." Her heart clenched. "You bought my downfall." Alexander met her gaze but didn't deny it. "Yes." The fire inside her ignited. "You're a monster." He smirked slightly. "I'm a businessman. This isn't business. This is cruelty." Alexander took another step forward, his expression darkening. "And what do you think this world is, Valeria? Do you think money and power come without victims, without sacrifices?" Her stomach twisted. "So I was your sacrifice?" He didn't answer immediately, and that was worse than any spoken confirmation. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, trying to process the depth of his actions. But then something flickered in his eyes. For just a fraction of a second, hesitation, something was missing from this story. Valeria realized it. She had been so focused on hating him that she had nearly missed the most important clue. If Alexander had always known who she was, if he had orchestrated her downfall before she even met him, why had he continued this for so long? She narrowed her eyes. "You wanted me to find out." Alexander remained silent, but she already knew the answer. "You could have kept me in the dark forever, but you left clues. You left cracks." Alexander swirled his whiskey glass between his fingers. "And why would I do that?" Valeria held his gaze. "Because somehow this is part of your plan." He finally smiled, and that only made her more uneasy. "You've always been sharp, Valeria." She took a step closer, refusing to look away. "Tell me the truth, Alexander. Everything." He was silent for a moment. Then he picked up one of the papers from the table and slid it toward her. Valeria hesitated before picking it up. When she saw what it was, the air left her lungs. A merger agreement. Edward Vaughan's name was bolded at the bottom, his signature scrawled across the page. But it wasn't just that. In the final clause, something made her blood run cold. The guarantee of this alliance will be formalized through the union of the involved parties. Her stomach churned. "This is an arranged marriage." Alexander nodded. "Yes," her mind spun. "You and Edward, you needed to seal this deal, and I was the means to make that happen." Alexander studied her, the tension between them thickening. "And now you understand." A bitter taste filled her mouth. It wasn't just a bet. It wasn't just about control. Alexander needed her to keep his empire intact, and in the process he had obliterated everything she once was. The silence stretched between them, until Valeria let out a low, humorless laugh, a laugh filled with pain. "You really did use me for everything, didn't you?" Alexander pressed his lips together but didn't deny it. The rage surged back, stronger than before. She grabbed the contract, crumpling it in her fists before tossing it onto the table. "This won't end the way you planned." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "No? No." Her voice was steady. "If I was a pawn in this game, then it's my turn to play." She turned on her heel and started toward the door. But before stepping out, she paused. Without looking back, she said, "You're going to regret choosing me, Alexander." And then she was gone, leaving him alone in the dimly lit room. Alexander remained still, eyes fixed on the door she had just walked through. Then he exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Something inside him told him that Valeria was right. But deep down, the question that haunted him wasn't if he would regret it, it was when, and worse. What would Valeria do now that she knew the truth? The Carter mansion had never felt so suffocating. Every wall, every meticulously placed piece of furniture, every luxury screaming status, it all seemed like a cruel reminder of everything Valeria had lost. Alexander hadn't just destroyed her life. He had molded it to serve a purpose she had never chosen. But now that she knew the truth, she would never be anyone's pawn again. She descended the staircase with steady steps. Her heart pounded, but her face remained unreadable. If Alexander wanted a game, then she would play, but by her rules. That afternoon, Valeria left the mansion without telling anyone. She knew she was being watched. Alexander didn't trust her enough to let her walk freely, but he underestimated her determination. Henry had already given her the pieces of the puzzle. Now, she needed something to remind her of who she was. Before Alexander Carter walked into her life, she needed someone who still saw her as Valeria Sinclair, and there was only one person who could do that. The neighborhood she had grown up in looked smaller than she remembered. The streets were the same, but the life she once knew there no longer existed. She stopped in front of a simple door, feeling her heartbeat quicken. It had been years since she last stood here. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. Seconds later, the door opened, and then Valeria felt her chest tighten. My God! The woman standing before her was an older, wearier version of the friend she had once called a sister. Camilla. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Valeria? Her voice was hesitant, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Before Valeria could respond, Camilla pulled her into a tight embrace. Valeria closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the warmth of a memory made real, the last person who had truly cared about her. "I thought you were dead." The words struck her harder than any blow. She pulled back, cupping Camilla's face in her hands. "I'm alive." Camilla blinked, studying her. "You look different." Valeria let out a dry chuckle. "Life did that to me." Camilla pulled her inside, shutting the door behind them. "You need to tell me everything." Hours later, Camilla was still trying to process everything she had heard. Valeria had told her about Alexander, about the marriage, about the truth behind it all. "So you're trapped with him?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Valeria pressed her lips together. "Not yet, but he thinks I am." Camilla shook her head. "What are you going to do?" Valeria stared out the window, watching the sun begin to set. Her path was already decided. "I'm going to destroy Alexander Carter." By the time Valeria returned to the mansion, it was past 8 in the evening. Alexander was in his office as usual, but this time he didn't wait for her to come to him. He came to her. "Went to see someone." His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Valeria smiled, tilting her head slightly. "You already know the answer." Alexander was silent for a moment before stepping closer. "What do you want, Valeria?" She held his gaze. "I want to watch you fall." His lips curled into a slow smile. "And are you willing to burn with me?" The silence between them was razor-sharp. Valeria could feel her heart pounding, but her decision had already been made. Alexander Carter might be powerful, but she was no longer the woman he had manipulated at the start. She was something else now, and if he thought he would control this game until the end, he was gravely mistaken. That night was unlike any other. Alexander Carter always seemed in control of everything, but Valeria noticed something new in his eyes. He knew she was ready to strike, and that intrigued him. She walked across the lounge, her heels echoing against the marble floor, feeling Alexander's gaze on her. But this wasn't just any look. This was the gaze of a player who had finally met his match. Valeria stopped in front of him, crossing her arms. "What happens if I walk out of this house right now?" Alexander took a sip of his whiskey before answering. "Nothing." She frowned. "Nothing?" He placed the glass down on the table and stepped closer, stopping just inches away. "You've uncovered everything, Valeria. If you're still here, it's because you want something more." Her chest tightened. He was right. She could have left. She could have run, but she didn't. Because she didn't just want justice. She wanted revenge, and for that, she had to stay in the game. Alexander studied her face. "You don't want to run. You want to play." Her eyes gleamed with defiance. "And what if I do?" Alexander smirked. Then this might be the first time I play without knowing who will win." The air between them grew thick. Valeria felt an unfamiliar electricity crackling in the space between them, something she never wanted to admit. But there was no time for distractions. Everything now depended on a single detail. She needed to uncover what truly motivated Alexander, and she knew exactly how to do it. The next morning, Valeria walked into Carter Industries unannounced. She didn't ask for permission. She simply entered. Employees looked up in surprise as she strode through the corridors as if she owned the place. And maybe, in some way, she did. She stopped in front of Alexander's secretary. "I want to see my husband." The woman hesitated. "He's in a meeting." Valeria smiled. "Not anymore." She pushed the door open without waiting for a response. Alexander was seated at his desk, across from Leonardo Vaughan. When he saw her, his brows lifted slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. Leonardo, however, frowned. "Mrs. Carter, I wasn't aware you were involved in company decisions." Valeria gave him a cool smile. "Neither was I. But my husband insists I should understand his business better." She sat across from them without an invitation. Alexander intertwined his fingers over the desk. "What do you want, Valeria?" She tilted her head. "The truth. All of it." Leonardo let out a low chuckle. "And what makes you think Alexander owed you that?" Her eyes locked onto Alexander's. "Because I'm part of this game now, and you know it." Alexander remained silent. Then, finally, he said something she hadn't expected. "Then come with me." The car glided down the road. In silence, Alexander drove, his face unreadable. Valeria sat beside him, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. Where was he taking her? Minutes later, they arrived at an isolated location, far from the city's towering buildings, an old, abandoned estate. Valeria stepped out of the car, looking around. "What is this place?" Alexander shoved his hands into his pockets. "The beginning of everything." She frowned. He walked to the door and pushed it open. Valeria hesitated before following him inside. The interior was covered in dust, but remnants of what this place once was were still visible. A large conference table, empty bookshelves. And then Valeria saw it, a portrait. A man in a suit, one who looked strikingly similar to Alexander, but older. Her eyes widened in understanding. "Your father." Alexander nodded. "This was the first Carter Industries office. My father built everything here." Valeria crossed her arms. "And what does this have to do with me?" Alexander looked into her eyes. "My father taught me that power comes from manipulation, that you can't let people believe they have choices." A shiver ran down her spine. Alexander took a step closer. "And then I met you." Valeria remained still. "You were my perfect piece, Valeria, but I made a mistake." She took a deep breath. "And what was your mistake, Alexander?" He hesitated for a second. Then finally he admitted, "I didn't predict that you could change me." Silence consumed the space around them. Valeria didn't know what to say because, for the first time, Alexander Carter seemed human. But it was too late for that. She closed her eyes for a moment, then took a step back. "This doesn't change anything." Alexander exhaled heavily. "I know." Valeria looked at him one last time before walking out the door. Her heart pounded in her chest, because for the first time she was certain of one thing. Alexander Carter never planned to fall for her, but he did. And now she had to decide, revenge or something far more dangerous. The cold wind cut through Valeria's skin as she stepped out of that abandoned building. Her thoughts were in chaos. Alexander Carter was a monster, but now For the first time he looked remorseful, and that made her even angrier. After all, what good was regret after everything he had done? But there was something worse. The regret seemed real. She didn't want to feel that. She didn't want to see humanity in that man. She wanted to hate him until the end, but she didn't know if she could. The ride back was silent. Alexander drove without hurry, his gaze fixed on the road. Valeria sat beside him, arms crossed, pretending to be indifferent, but her chest was rising and falling faster than it should. She finally broke the silence. "Why are you showing me all this?" Alexander didn't take his eyes off the road. "Because I'm tired of lying to you." Valeria laughed, void of humor. "Convenient. Now that I've already figured everything out, you decide to come clean." Alexander gripped the steering wheel. "No, Valeria, I should have done this sooner, but He hesitated, and that made her watch him more closely. "But what, Alexander?" He sighed, closing his eyes for a second before answering. "But I didn't want to lose you." Her heart skipped a beat. She hated that, hated how a simple sentence had shaken her. She turned to the window, pretending those words didn't hold any weight. But they did, and she knew it. When they arrived at the mansion, Alexander didn't stop her from stepping out of the car first. She crossed the hall with hurried steps, desperate to escape the turmoil inside her. But before she could go up the stairs, she heard his voice. "Valeria." She stopped, closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and turned around. Alexander stood in the middle of the hall, hands in his pockets. But there was something different about him, something vulnerable. "I know you'll never forgive me." His voice was low, almost a whisper. She crossed her arms. "No, I won't." Alexander nodded as if he'd already expected that answer. "But I also know I can't keep doing this." Valeria narrowed her eyes. "Doing what?" Alexander reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table between them. "The annulment papers." The air left Valeria's lungs. She looked at the envelope, then back at him. "You want to end the marriage?" Alexander held her gaze. "I want to give you a choice, for the first time." Her chest tightened, because this she hadn't expected. "And if I sign?" Alexander smirked slightly. "Then you're free from me. You can walk out of this house and never look back." She felt the air stuck in her throat. That was all she wanted, right? That was the plan from the beginning. So why wouldn't her hand move? Alexander took a step closer. "But if you don't sign, then I want you to stay, by choice." Valeria felt her heart pounding. He was handing her all the control. After everything, after all the manipulation, the games, the lies, he was finally letting her choose. She looked at the envelope on the table. Her freedom was right there, but did she really want to leave? Or did she want something much more dangerous? She lifted her eyes to Alexander. He was waiting, no rush, no pressure, because now the game was over, and only she could decide what happened next. The envelope was still on the table, heavy, as if it carried more than just a simple contract, as if it held Valeria's future in her hands. Alexander stood before her, his expression neutral, but his eyes revealed more than he wanted. He didn't insist. He didn't ask her to stay. He just waited, and that disturbed her more than any manipulation ever had. Because for the first time, Alexander Carter was letting her choose. The silence between them was thick, laden with everything they couldn't say. Valeria took a deep breath. Every part of her screamed to grab that envelope and walk out of this house. But something inside her hesitated. What did that hesitation mean? Anger, confusion, or something she wasn't ready to admit? She picked up the envelope. Alexander didn't react. He just watched. Her fingers traced the seal. She could open it, she could sign it, she could leave and never look back. But then Alexander did something that completely disarmed her. He took a step forward, pulled, His hands from his pockets and in the softest, most sincere voice she had ever heard, said, "I love you, Valeria." Her heart stopped. Alexander had never said that before, not even when they pretended to be the perfect couple. Never. And now, when she was about to leave him, he finally said it. Her anger should have flared. She should have felt disgust, resentment. But all she felt was the weight of those words. Because Alexander Carter wasn't the kind of man to say things he didn't mean, and that meant he was telling the truth. The envelope trembled in her hands. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and then, slowly, she placed the envelope back on the table. Alexander saw the gesture, but he didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just waited, because he knew this wasn't an answer. Valeria lifted her gaze to meet his. "I don't trust you." Alexander nodded. "I know. I don't forgive you. I know that too." The silence stretched. Valeria stepped forward, stopping just inches from him. "But if I stay, it will be on my terms." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Your terms?" She held his gaze, unwavering. "No secrets, no manipulation, no games. I want the truth, always." Alexander stared at her, and then, finally, he smiled. "Deal." At that moment, Valeria knew she was about to do something reckless, that she was stepping into something she could never fully control. But for the first time, the choice was hers, and that was all that mattered. Months later, the whole world knew the news. Alexander Carter and Valeria Sinclair were together, but this time, by choice. They weren't a perfect couple. They fought. They argued. They were too intense for each other. But in the end, they always came back. Because amid all the destruction, manipulation and vengeance, they had found something no one could plan. Something even Alexander Carter hadn't foreseen. Something real. And for the first time in her life, Valeria was no longer a pawn. She was a queen, and this time she was playing to win. What did you think of this story? Give it a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important to us. If you made it this far, comment chocolate. Only those who watched until the end will understand your message. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. For more inspiring stories, leave a like and share it with someone you care about.